people talk about it that way for CEOs and new business owners, you got to think of it as the company risk or the corporate risk. Because you tend to think of the functional risk because they're really good like at writing their program or whatever they're doing, right? But this is where
I'm not a Zoom
I know.
enthusiast anymore, but
We'll just make a
it
video.
happens, it happens. You have a seat, yeah.
It's much more conversation than.
Yeah.
Okay. So, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for everybody that's online. I hope that you're all having a great morning. So my name is Linda Upland. I am the Director of Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Commercialization for the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley. And we want to welcome you today to our Community Health Innovation Seminar Series in collaboration with VelocityTX in San Antonio and the Methodist Healthcare Ministries. This is a series that has been going on for a couple of months. You know, we kind of stopped, after the holidays and kind of took a little break, but we're back on with a whole new series of sessions that we'll be having in the next couple of months to offer you that knowledge and, better understanding of some of these business practices in the area of social determinants of health, which is a topic that is very much present here in the Rio Grande Valley, and it's something that we are all very passionate about, and we want to make sure that you have the resources and the best practices in terms of the business and commercialization side to be able to be part of and create or develop something in relation to. Velocity Texas is an accelerator program in San Antonio and one of our main partners, and we love to collaborate with them in different projects. So we're very excited that they invited us to be part and host this series here at eBridge and across the Rio Grande Valley. And I think Derek will present a little bit more on that. So we welcome everybody on behalf of the UTRGV here at eBridge. I welcome everybody today, and I hope you enjoy your session with our great speaker that we have. And I'm going to introduce Derek. He is the director of Velocity Texas, and he'll talk a little bit more about the session. You're welcome.
Hey guys, my name is Derek Rose, Director of Operations at Velocity Texas. Thank you
all in person and those of you who are viewing online for attending today's session. I'm really excited that you're here. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our partners at UTRGV for hosting us here at the eBridge Center. We really enjoyed our partnership and are excited to continue the series. For those who may not be as familiar with VelocityTX, we're based out of San Antonio. We have a 12-acre development downtown. So that's illustrated by the picture behind me. So we have both of the highlighted areas in orange. So those two blocks, each is about 6 acres. Really excited that the first block is finishing development here in the next month or two. So we have only one building left that's under construction, which we're really excited about. We're finishing out 6 BSL2 labs. And then once we finish the 6 BSL2 labs, we'll be moving across the street into phase 2 of development, which is close to 700,000 square feet of office and lab space. And so VelocityTX is a nonprofit. And what we do is we help early stage life sciences companies that have dual use technology accelerate their path to commercialization. And so we do that through our model, which is connect, support, and fund. And so we help these companies get connected to resources in San Antonio and across South Texas. We help support them through a variety of program offerings based on their stage of development. And we have access to different funding opportunities, whether that's through an angel investor network that's part of our foundation, or we help the companies apply to non-dilutive federal government funding opportunities called SIBR and SITR. So that's a little bit about VelocityTX. So what brings us here today is a partnership with Methodist Healthcare Ministries. So as you know, Methodist and Methodist Healthcare Ministries have hundreds of locations across South Texas, and we're in a partnership with them designed to help companies learn the foundations of establishing a successful business, as well as educating people on the social determinants of health. Social determinants, who may not be as familiar with what that is, they're the non-medical factors that determine a person's well-being. And so on the screen behind me, there's a handful of those, such as a person's access to education and the quality of education that they get, access to quality healthcare, the neighborhood or environment that they find themselves living in, social community context, as well as even economic stability. And so as a recap, we're doing a 10-month monthly seminar series leading up to an accelerator that's going to be in the fall of 2024. So kind of what we started this back in September, and a couple of those sessions you'll see behind me. So we started off by doing, what is your innovation? We learned about the lean business model canvas. We took a look at what is your business plan, and really kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of planning out a business venture before actually kicking things off. And then we had Matt Duke talk to us in November about legally starting your business and considerations in terms of legal entity type, looking at funding and all the things that are needed to get that business off the ground. Today with us, we have Linda Loftus. Linda is going to be talking to us more so about the operational risks and mitigating those risks when getting your company started. But do be on the lookout for our accelerator that's coming up in the fall. Applications are live right now on our website. We've got a couple bullet points behind me on the screen, but there's coaching and mentoring. It's a 6-week-long program. We get to network with other entrepreneurs. And then at the end of the day, the cohort gets access to Methodist and their resource network. And so feel free to find more information on our website, which is velocitytexas.org. But with that, I will kick it over to Linda. Linda's got a great presentation for us today, so feel free to ask questions along the way. It should be a great time. Linda?
Thank you so much, Derek. Just push the
right arrow is forward and
yeah,
left is
okay,
back.
great.
Yes, ma'am.
And I can see it there too. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Linda Loftus, and I'm the principal of Loftus Management Consulting. And typically what I do is I concentrate on the general and administrative side of businesses. So I've worked with Velocity over the years, and I do a lot of these things to help businesses sort of figure out what they need to do, where the risks are, and kind of actually help you with some of the operational challenges that you have. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about startups and risk management. And I love this conversation. Most startups don't even think about this. You intuitively know about risk, but you're not actually putting it down on paper and thinking about what the risks are. So I'm very impressed that the folks here in Brownsville and the folks in San Antonio think that this is an important topic for startups. Okay, so the topic is operational risks every startup should understand. I'll preface this by saying I'm the backup quarterback. I was not the original speaker, so you got to be a little gentle on me. And so we put this presentation together, pretty quickly, and Derek was very supportive of this one, but this is a new presentation that I've done for Velocity. I actually am involved in some of their other programming, so I do a lot of the stuff with funding and other things like that, but I love this topic, okay? All right, so the first question is, what is the purpose of risk management? How is that supposed to help companies? And I did put the answer on this slide, but basically the whole concept of risk management from a corporate point of view is you establish a systemic approach to managing risks. Now, typically the way people say that is it's managing risk to scaling and growing your company. But for some of you, you're not scaling yet and you're not growing because you're still in this startup or pre-revenue stage. But risk management is critically important even to launching the businesses. So that's why I have that in there. And I think you should be thinking about it at all times. And in fact, most of the times when I have clients, we go through a risk assessment. And one of the things they determine is they're not ready to start yet because they've got too much risk. And so we de-risk before we even launch a company. And so that's a big part of it, right? But this is done all the time. And you're going to see some really nice models on how we do this. Okay. Why is this so hard for startups? And basically, why don't you do this? Why don't you think about risk management? And the first thing is there's a lot for you to do. You're very busy and it's usually you. Two, you don't know how to do this. You know the concept, right? You don't want to have things done at risk, but you don't really understand risk management and how methodical it can be. You don't often think it's important at this stage because you're like, well, I need to get my money, my product off, and I need to do this. So you don't think that thinking through risk mitigation is an important thing to do. You think you know the major risks. So every time I have a startup, I'll say, what do you think the risks are? And they'll give me the 2 or 3, and they're usually right on that, but they're missing some. So the reason you don't do this is you think you got it all under hand. The other reason you don't do it is because you're understaffed. You have a lot to do. And if you had a company and you had 50 employees, you'd probably have somebody on compliance. You'd be doing risk management as team stuff. It's different, right? So you're understaffed, you don't have as much money, so you're not doing this. You don't think it's critical, right, to your core. And then if you're smart and you really get this, you already know you're operating at risk. You're like, yeah, I'm already operating at risk, so I can handle this, right? I'm good, right? Okay, so let's think about this. Okay, typically when people do risk assessment, there's 4 stages of it, and I was supposed to number these. So I was supposed to do 1, 2, 3, and then put 4 here. Okay, so just imagine that I've numbered it. Didn't get around to it. Okay, so the first thing you do when you do risk management is you identify the risks, and we're going to be doing some of that today. And you can do it across a strategic level or operationally across functional areas. And you just say, what are all the things that are at risk? And I'm going to give you lots of examples today, right? After you identify it, then you evaluate it. You go through and say, is that a risk now? Is that really important? Right? Is that a threat to the business? So you evaluate sort of the seriousness of it. Then you come up with a plan to control it and mitigate it, right? How do we reduce that risk? How do we have a plan B? And then you usually go down in most companies to monitor and risk. So once you've got these risk mitigation strategies, you're in there assessing it. Did we solve the problem? Is it coming back? Can we do better the next time, right? So typically when people talk about risk management, they do the first, the second, the third, and what is now here, fifth. But here's the one with the big fun arrow that is important for startups and for people in the early stage, and particularly people who are running companies that are pre-revenue. Because you're undercapitalized and understaffed, you have another step, which is you got to triage, which means you're running at risk all the time because you don't have enough people, you don't have a lot of experience, you don't really understand what all the risks are, you don't take the time to do it. So when you see 5 risks, you're like, oh God, yeah, they're all a problem. Which ones can I work on now? So the more you're in formation or launching a business, the more risk you're operating at because you can't manage all the risk to the company and you kind of live with it. And so you're making decisions all the time of, I know I'm at risk here, but I can't get to those. And I hope nothing bad happens there until I can get the company to here or commercialization or at break even. And then I'll have all the staff, I can do all of that. So triaging is a really important step because you're operating at risk. And the idea is when you start a company, you know, the gap between where you should be functioning at risk management to what you're doing is here. And then the idea is by the time you get to break even, you're really managing risk and identifying it and dealing with it all the time. But triaging is the difference. Okay, so where is risk? You can think about risks in a company and you can think about it in its functional area. So I think of strategic risk as a corporate risk. And functional risk are what I would call operational. And this presentation is supposed to be talking a little bit about operational risks, but the identification of it is the same in both places. So if you think about a little bit about corporate risk, what would make the company have trouble, right? So finance, do you have enough cash to run the business? Governance, do you have all the compliance documents? Do you understand about the Corporate Transparency Act, which is coming through in this year? Do you understand all the things that are legally important for your business to do that? And I had a couple of others, but it's things like, is the regulatory environment changing? Are you having any trouble with legislation that says, you could have to be making a product and the FDA can come out and say, we're not going to allow that product anymore. So there's risks that you can identify on the corporate side. On the operational side, this is where you kind of think it's a functional area. So what are the risks in what you're doing? So if you're writing a program, or if you're building a drug, or you're trying to look for biomarkers, or you're doing a device, you kind of know how to do that, right? You're probably pretty good at that operational side, but there's so many components on the operational side. So you can be in manufacturing or production, you could be in a regulatory, you could be in quality assurance, it's not clerical, it's clinical, sales and marketing, HR and technology. So there's all these functional areas. And the way to think about that is, if you were a big company and you were the CEO and you had 5,000 employees, what would be all the departments that would report to you, right? You'd have a CFO, you'd have a chief operating officer, you might have a CFO, right? And then they have all these functional areas that report to them. But it doesn't matter if you're a startup, you still have those responsibilities in all of those areas. And it's usually just you, maybe you and a guy, maybe you and your cousin, like whoever's starting your business. But you have all the same functional responsibilities. So mapping out risk is really important, because it's kind of, my favorite company, as I say, it's 3 guys in a box, right? 3 guys in an office, which is a lot of what the startups are. It's a small group of people. And yet you start these companies and you just kind of assume, well, we can just kind of operate at risk. Come on in. But in fact, there's operational risk all over the place. And the less people you have, the more you ought to just figure out what are all the areas that you have risk in, and then which ones can you actually manage and attack, which ones are important to the company. Okay. So effective strategies. How do you identify risks? So when people say, well, we'll write down all the risks. How do I know, right? The first answer is, you get somebody my age, right? I've been around the block. So why do I know risk to companies more than you? I'm older than you. I've been around. I've had more business experience. I've done more things, right? I'm not smarter than you, just been around. So one of the things you do is you have to start by saying, what are the right questions for you to ask? And that's typically when you're inexperienced in business, you don't know the right questions to ask. So we're going to ask some of them today, okay? And it really comes down to 2 things. What would shut your business down? And what would hurt you, right? 2 kind of different, but what would shut you down? And one of them, you don't have enough cash, right? I was saying to Derek today, I'm getting more resumes from people whose companies ran out of cash and they're out looking for work, right? So yeah, if you don't have cash, we know that's a risk, right? Where is that? That's on the strategic level. That's a company-wide thing, but it affects everything. So the questions are, what would shut you down? What would hurt the company? And I have a couple of examples. So everybody should be thinking about these as potential risk risk factors. Cash, do you have enough cash? Typically, I say to people, you should have at least 6 months operating cash. If you're a larger company, if you want to pass an audit, you have to pass 12 months of cash. That's called a going concern. And if you can't prove that you've got 12 months of cash from the time of the audit, you don't get an audit. You don't pass the audit, right? So people care a lot about cash. With supply chain interruptions, right? We saw this with COVID, right? So COVID now happens and you got a part and it's sitting on a boat out in the middle of Los Angeles Bay. You can't get it. Great. So guess what happens to you? You can't make a product. You can't prototype it. You can't get it approved. You can't sell it if you're supplies. And what happened in the United States is, all this is a bit built, a lot of business conversation, but for a while we were manufacturing a lot of stuff on our own in the United States, right? We were really good at it. And then businesses decided, oh, well, we don't like American labor. It's too expensive. So we'll just outsource this. So we're getting all our parts from Taiwan and China and Mexico or anywhere else. And the problem is, one, you could have an administration that shuts down the borders and doesn't let the stuff come through. You could have COVID shut down and you got COVID on a ship in Los Angeles and they won't let them dock, right? All of this stuff can happen, right? And so if you outsource things, if you outsource anything, you're at risk. That's an additional risk. It's the same thing I say to people if you have a company and it's a software program, right? Back in the day when Silicon Valley was the hot thing, all of the people in Silicon Valley who were starting those companies, they wrote the programs. Those were the programs. They were the dropouts from Stanford who could write code. So if you're in South Texas and you got a company and you need an app for that, right? And so you're going to hire a developer or somebody who codes. Guess what happens? If you don't know how to code, you're at risk because you don't know if that person's doing it right. And you may not have the right agreement to make sure that all of that IP goes to you. One of the things people do is when they hire a coder, they just sign that contract for services and I'll pay you, 10,000 or 20,000. But that document, that contract should be reviewed by an intellectual property attorney because there's 7 things you have to do in order to make sure all the IP goes to you. Otherwise, guess what? Somebody knows your secret sauce. They know your Kentucky Fried Chicken recipe. If they're writing the code for your program, if you're not a coder, how do you know whether that's right or not? How do you know that it was done? You see functionality in the end, if you're paying attention, but you don't know anything. And you're also walking around with somebody out there in the world who knows exactly what your program is doing. How do you stop that person from selling it, competing with you, all that kind of stuff? So where's the things that could shut you down or hurt you? That's one of them right there. Every time you outsource, you're vulnerable. We have a company who had a device and they had a part that was made in Taiwan. And in the United States, if you're going to obsolete a part, you have to declare it. So you say, oh, in 5 years, this part's going to be obsolete. So everybody who's making airplanes or locomotives can adjust, right? Oh, no, not the Taiwanese. They can just say we're no longer making it. So they had a product and they were getting ready to go. And all of a sudden they can no longer get one part, had to absolutely find a new one, had to get validated, verified, blah, 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 $450,000, 10-month delay. One part from Taiwan was a huge issue. So guess what? Did they have the operating capital to do that? Happens all the time. So when you outsource, and that includes writing code, whatever you outsource, you got risk, okay? That's what I call supply chain. Not able to obtain the required regulation. So if you're doing anything in healthcare and you need FDA approval or the NIH or anybody that has a regulatory thing, guess what? You're at risk because you can't control them. They say yes or no. So that's a risk. What happens if they say no? What if it happens if they say, maybe you have to do 6 more months of research? If you have to do clinical studies and you did 100 pigs, they may come back and say, yeah, that really isn't enough data, go do 200 more. How are you going to fund that? How are you going to last? So you're not in control of making a product. If you make a sweater and you can make that sweater in a day and I can go sell it the next day, I have less risk because I can get to revenue really quickly. Anytime you can't get to revenue or you have barriers by somebody else who can shut you down or slow you down, you have risk and you got to manage that. You got to identify it. You got to name it. You got to own it. Okay. And then I would say things like, everybody thinks their product's great. I can't tell you how many clients I have where it doesn't work. You think it's great, you launch it, you sell it, and guess what? All the customers are really unhappy because it doesn't work. You'd be surprised. What happens? Do you, as an owner of a company, do you have a scenario that says, what if we get it into the market and the thing doesn't work? What if it burns somebody's finger? What if somebody else comes in behind me and beats me to market, right? Do you have a plan for that? Because that'll kill your business. And if you don't think about that and at least own those responsibilities, then you're going to be in trouble. Okay, so how do you figure this out? One, you have to know the right questions to ask. And the 2 that I always say is what would shut you down, right? Or what would hurt you. The second thing is you talk to people like me, old people. You talk to people who've been in business for a while, who've been around the block. You talk to lawyers and accountants, all these people. You talk to people in your industry and they'll help you identify risk, right? Because they know something, they know more than you. You can also talk amongst yourself. Because I do like it when you have different industry types, because you might have some risks in an insurance-based industry that don't exist in a software company, but you'd be surprised how much similarities there would be. So I like it when places like eBridge or other places have these working sessions where people are actually talking about risk and marking it down, right? The other thing is industry benchmarks. That's out there. So if you're in telecommunications or if you're in insurance or you're in anything, guess what? You can find anything on the internet now. You can find the benchmarks, and the benchmarks are exactly this. What are the risks in this industry at various stages of the company? Where are you vulnerable, right? And so that would be the second. So that's how you find it. And then the third thing is you're going to write them down. And I'm going to show you some examples of how you do it. Nobody ever writes them down in your stage. I wish you would, but you never do it. So here I am going to tell you how to do this. Okay. The way risk assessment is done is you can do it any way you want. You can make it up any way you want. There's no rhyme or reason. But it typically comes out of people who are engineers and in manufacturing. These people are methodical. They're like accountants. They know what they're doing, right? And if they make a bridge, they need to make sure it doesn't fall down. So they have lots of checks and balances, and they are constantly, anytime you're producing things or you're building something, they are very methodical at risk assessment because they've got to make sure they've got it all down. So this actually comes from an example from manufacturing. Okay, but it works for anything because you can do this on a corporate side or any functional side. Like I would do this with things like even recruitment and scaling up for hiring people, right? So one side is severity of harm and the other side is the probability of harm. Now you can assign the numbers any way you want, and you can have the categories be anything you want. But here, you could say catastrophic, critical, major, minor, blah, negligible. And then here's the frequency of it. So if it's catastrophic, but it's improbable, it's not probably something you need to deal with first, right? So you see the color grids, the kind of idea is if it's catastrophic and it's frequent, oh, that's a problem. And guess what normally happens in startups? Running out of cash is catastrophic and it's usually frequent. So when I tell people, look, you can't launch a business till you can have the money to break even. The reason is because I know the risk to the company is massive. It's catastrophic if you run out of cash. And if you don't have enough money when you start the business to get to break even, then you're constantly running out of cash. And so if you're doing all these pitches and you win, and you have to have on your risk management that you don't win, like what if I don't win? You get 20,000, 25,000, blah, that ain't enough. And so you're constantly what? The reoccurrence of that risk is coming back in your face all the time. And so for a manager, what you're trying to do is get things that are in these red zones, so to speak, down to things that are not as important. But if you don't actually put it down on paper and face that reality, you don't face the truth, which is why a lot of startups are like, oh yeah, I'll do the pitch and I'll win and I'll move on. Well, what if you don't win the pitch? And if you win the pitch and you get 25,000, is it the 550,000 you need to get to break even? No. So what's your plan on that? Own it. Okay. But this is kind of how you do it. And you can do any number you want, but I'm just kind of showing you the way like engineers and people in manufacturing do it, which I think is kind of cool, right? And then the other way they do this, which I think is also kind of cool. And when they do a risk assessment document, they have all the definitions of what catastrophic is. Then they have another page with that grid. And then, it's a very big document, right? That's ridiculous. Anyway, but this one I really like too, because they would have the grid. And in this case, you can see people are doing 1 through 3 or 1 through 4, whatever the numbers are. And so in this particular case, they list the risk. So usually they'll have it by HR, clinical, regulatory, all the functional areas that you have, or the operational risks. They list the risk, and then they give it on the 5-point scale. They have, you can see major, minor, insignificant. Then they have the probability. So it's the same thing as the previous grid I showed you. What is the severity of harm? What's the probability of harm? They add one, which I love, called detectability. Can you find it? So maybe it's a catastrophic risk and it's really hard, but it's really bad to the company, but it's very hard to detect. That's a bigger danger than if you could see something catastrophic and you could see it. So running out of cash is a very bad harm, very bad risk, but you can see it because you all know how much money is in the business bank account. The less money you have, I always say this, the less money you have, you can always tell me exactly what's in your bank account. If you're Bezos, do you think he knows exactly what's in his checking account? No. But if I ask any of you guys what's in your checking account today, you're pretty close, right? Why? Because you're running close to that money. Cash is important to you, right? But I like this one. The other thing that's really kind of cool is what they do here is then they do this risk, they multiply, right? This time, this and this. And so what happens for senior manager or managers, what we do is we say things like anything over 6 gets flagged. We care about that. So when the team is coming up with this and I see a 9 and a 12, I'm real concerned about that, right? So it's just a fast way to show somebody what we think the risks are, but what does it do for you? It forces you to deal with it, okay? This one also shows mitigation and escalation. I love this. Mitigation, and they usually have like a responsible party. So you would name who with the team, but sometimes it's only you and the company or you and your cousin. So what difference does it make? But in this case, the mitigation is what are you going to do about that? And what I like on escalation is if you've got a mitigation plan, so you've got, okay, we're going to raise $50,000. And the escalation says, if you haven't raised 20,000 by 3 months, it gets raised. So the number goes, all of a sudden that gets flagged to senior management or the owners or the board of directors or whatever. So you say, here's my plan. But if it's not working, at this point, we escalate it. I mean, it's got to go higher up. And it's a great way to say, you can't just say what the mitigation is. You have to actually mitigate it. You actually have to resolve the problem or else it becomes a larger company issue. Now, these are obviously things that are used for bigger companies with bigger teams, but it's the same idea because you would be the person responsible, let's say, but you got to manage risk. Okay. So those are the ways you could do it. Now, let's think about some of the vulnerabilities. So the best thing for you is for me to give you some ideas of the things that you're running at risk for. Okay. So I like these questions. What would make your company fail? What would make you go out of business? And what would make you suffer significant setbacks? That's the questions you're asking. Because what happens with people in the startup space, you love your product or idea. You think it's a go because there's no market for it. You think you're the bomb. You're going to make this. You're going to make a lot of money. Investors are like, you love your idea. And so you never think about the downside. What if it doesn't work? What if you don't have enough money? What if somebody comes out with I had a client who built a particular device and they said, oh, we don't need a lot of regulation and we can get out to market real soon. Oh, they made it. And the day they launched, two of their friends showed them that you could buy the same thing on Amazon from some company out of China. And I was like, yeah, and they undersold it by $250. They didn't do any of their research on that stuff, right? And they took too long to get to market and, you don't really need it. And guess what? They sold one. They were out of business in 2 months. And they had done all this work and all this ideation and all this planning and all this marketing and my team they did the whole portfolio of a pitch deck. Nobody invested in them. They had to go out and sell the thing and they were out of business in 2 months. Okay, so here are the things that you ought to think about because these are real. What if you don't have any money to proceed? Do you have enough money? And the issue on money is not do you have enough money for the next 3 months? Every business says, and when you really go in front of investors, and I'm going to tell you that the VCs are not going to touch you. You're too risky. You're not developed enough as a company. You're too young. But what the VCs always want to know is what's your break even? Where do you hit break even and how much does that mean? And so if it's going to take you 6 months or 6 years to get break even, so let's say if you're doing a drug, you have a long regulatory process, so it might be 8 years or 10 years, right? But whenever you get to commercialization, that's not the point they care about. Because your first sale, you can still lose money. I can sell 10 sweaters, but I can still go out of business. You see this in restaurants all the time. They're selling tacos and hamburgers all the time. Why are they going out of business? Because the amount of money they bring in doesn't match what their expenses are. Break even is when those equal. So if you know that you're going to hit break even, so the amount of sales that you project you're going to have equal your expenses in 8 months or 18 months, how much did it cost you every month to subsidize? Because you got to fund yourself until you get there. And it might be debt or anything else. You add up all those numbers. That's the amount of money you need to start a company. And you should have that before you start. But my point is, if you don't, and you're kind of going along, anybody who cares about your business is going to ask you, what's your break even? When do you hit break even? And how much is it going to cost you to get there? How much are you going to spend before you start breaking even? And that is the name of the game in a business. If you can't hit break even, you don't make it. I don't care how good your idea is. I don't care how wonderful you are. You're not going to make it. Okay. The other thing is, what if you have a business that has auditors or regulators, right? And they're going to come on site. If you're manufacturing something or if you're producing software, like the biggest thing with the FDA now is, I don't care if you make a software program, they are highly involved in investigating and regulating that because they care about validation and verification and they care about security. They don't want you to give out private protected health information. They don't want you to be hacked. So guess what? The FDA is forcing people who do IT and coding and programs, any of these apps for healthcare, it's got to go through the FDA. And they're not easy. So they take a long time. They can say no. They can ask you for information. So you go out and you tell people, hey, give me $100,000 because I'm going to get this approved in 6 months. From a business point of view, you can't say that because you don't know. You're not responsible. You don't get to be the FDA. So from a business point of view, what do you have to plan? 12 months, 18 months, right? Risk mitigation says, I better have cash for 12. I think it's going to be 6. The team is working on 6, but it might be 12 months, okay? You might get sued. You might be out there with I have had 2 clients in the last 5 years. They went out, tried to do a product, and guess what? They didn't do their research and they were infringing on somebody else's patent. Shut them down immediately. Okay, you're getting sued by stockholders who say, you didn't tell me everything that I needed to know. It's too risky. You can have investors who say, I gave you money in a convertible debt note and you said you would get the license agreement, or you said you would be passed by the FDA and you didn't do it. You didn't know what you're doing. They'll sue you. That'll shut you down, right? Right off the bat. The 3 biggest lawsuits from stockholders, patent infringement, HR, sexual discrimination, discrimination in employees and all that stuff, right? Okay. What if you have a cybersecurity breach? All of you guys are doing everything on the web, it's cloud-based, blah, blah. What if somebody locks up all your data and says, give me $50,000 or you're not getting it back? You have a plan for that? So usually what happens there is the startups say, well, that's pretty bad risk. That would shut me down. I could buy insurance for that, but I don't really want to deal with that because I think the probability is low. But the problem is, that's a good example of a probability maybe low, maybe not, but it would be catastrophic, right? And we'll talk a little bit about insurance. Okay, maybe you think that you've got a program or a device or a product and it's going to be great. What if it doesn't work? What if you think there's functionality, particularly in software packages, and you get out there, you're beta testing it, and the customers or the potential customers are like, yeah, this is horrible. Didn't work, didn't respond, blah, 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 right? So a lot of times when you're doing these technology programs, you're out there giving it out for free because you need some basic information on it. So you end up not making money in the beginning because you're giving that out to people to test and try and don't work. what happens? That's a delay, right? So you need more cash, whatever else, got to mark it down. Every company that is not in revenue should have on their risk assessment that my product or service doesn't work. Absolutely, because it's going to happen, okay? What if a competitor beats you to the market? What if it's a great idea, you make a great product, somebody's out in the market in front of you? Even if that product is not as good as yours, they got market presence. They're out there already making a sale. So now you got to tell somebody to stop buying theirs and buy yours. It's a different business problem. No one buys it. You make a great product, it works, and everybody said, yeah, I don't really need it, right? You think it's great, and that's the problem. You're the owner, you're the inventor, you're the whatever, and you think it's great, but you got to convince somebody to buy it. It's pretty easy to convince somebody to buy something when you cut my expenses. So if you develop a product and you're going to make my detection of oil leaks faster, more economical, you're going to save me money, you got a case. But if you want me to now buy something and I don't absolutely need it, it would be a convenience, it would be nice, it works. You still got to make me be convinced that I have to take money that I'm spending on other things, on my HEB bill or whatever else I'm doing, and now buy your product. So if you're not actually in a place where you're going to save businesses money, then you have a different problem. They may not want to buy it, even if it's a great idea and if they work. I got a company who wanted to do something with, giving better customer service in the grocery store. That's a great idea. And the whole thing worked. It was great. And nobody bought it. Okay. And what if you don't get regulatory approval? What if you think you're going to get approved and the FDA says no? Okay. All right. So where's risk? So there's risk on the corporate side, and then there's the functional areas. And I'll just go through a couple of these really fast because I want you to think of corporate risk too, right? So running out of money. So what is the mitigation? It would be like, we're going to raise X amount in debt by such and such time. We're going to go out and fundraise, which is hard for you guys to do because nobody's going to invest in you. You probably can't get a bank loan because you don't have any revenue, and you probably don't have any capital assets to provide as collateral. So what are you going to do? If you don't have the money now to fund your business, that has to be on your risk mitigation, and you have to come up with a plan. You got to figure out how you're going to get the money. And if you don't, and you keep working on the product, you're missing the point here. You got to have money to get to market, right? So you got to figure that out. What if you lose, like, here's all, you guys will have the slides. Basically, here's some of the things you have. Sometimes you have bad senior management. Sometimes your team is wrong. I have companies where the product's really good and everybody was like kumbaya, everybody got along. And 6 months later, they're all fighting. They're all out. Right? I always say to you, partnerships and other kinds of documents like that, where you have bylaws for corporation, things like that. What are they? They tell you how to run the business. I call them prenups. They're what happens if you break up, right? It happens a lot. What if you find out you're operating illegally? You broke the law. You didn't know it was wrong, but you did it. What if you have somebody in your accounting department who's stealing money from you? Right? This stuff happens all the time at corporate level. So what is your mitigation? Now I put on here, you say I already put in insurance. One of the things I do is I talk to people a lot about insurance. What is insurance? People will say to me, oh, when I get to this stage, I'll have money and I can buy insurance. Insurance is not something that a company has to do. What is insurance? Whether you're buying general corporate liability, whether you're buying health insurance, whether you're buying intellectual property insurance, there's like 5 kinds of that. What is insurance? Insurance is a risk mitigation strategy. So if you think you've got a vulnerable product that might burn somebody's hand when they use it, guess what? You have to have product liability, right? Somebody's going to sue you for that, right? So what is insurance? It's risk mitigation, because you can't go to zero risk on all that stuff. Sometimes you have to have insurance if you've got a license from UT and they want general corporate liability, which is good. I always like it. But the reality is, no business is required by law to have insurance. You do that because you've identified risks, and insurance is one of the risk mitigations, but it's not the only one. So I always say to people, the best response to risk mitigation in a company is to run a really good business and do it right. Do it ethically, do it right, have good standard operating procedures, know what you're doing. But if you run a business and you don't know how to run a business and you don't know all the parts, you're running at risk, right? Right off the bat. All right, functional areas. I like to remind people what the functional areas are, and you can, whatever they are in your business, right? So IT, if you had IT, it would be all these different things in IT. If you were in car manufacturing, you have all these. So basically the way to think about this is, if you had a company and you had a lot of employees, think about what your organizational chart would be. So if I'm the CEO, I'm the owner, then I would have a CFO, I have a chief operating officer, I might have a chief accounting officer, right? And then who would be in there? And you go down like 2 levels in your organization, those are your functional areas. Those are your operational areas. And in each one of those, you have risk. And guess what? That's a lot of risk. And guess what? It's usually just you. So it's a lot, right? It's a lot. And so the biggest part of this one is to say, oh God, there's a lot of risk out there. What is all the risk? And let me make the choices on the things that I need to deal with. That's that triaging. I can only get to these. I only know these.
What can I do? A lot of companies don't pay for insurance, so you can't use that as a risk mitigation now. But if you made some money or you got some funding, would you buy that and reduce some risk some places? Yes, right? So these are examples, but that's how I do it. When you're thinking about your functional areas, the way to do it is to think about yourself as the head of the whole organizational chart. How many layers do you go down and like, oh, accounts payable, accounts receivable, and they both go into the chief accounting officer. Chief accounting officer goes to the finance person. The finance person has tax, has all this other stuff. Like those are your functional areas. Like, for example, if you're not doing your tax returns and if you don't make any money, I don't care. You still owe franchise tax returns, right? In various states. Do you understand what doing business in a state is? Are you operating legally in a state? Did you register your business with the Secretary of State? Do you understand corporate transparency law? There's all this stuff out there. Think about this. The head of Chevron has the same responsibilities as you. And that person has a lot of people working for him. And you are running a business and you probably don't have any money and you're trying to get the same place. That's tough, right? And so it's really, really hard. Own it. Okay. This is where I hurt your feelings. Okay. What do you guys think is the biggest risk to your company right now? What do you think? Any answers?
I make stickers, intellectual properties, the most recent and
Okay.
the biggest one.
Okay. Any other answers?
Or yourself?
That's exactly right. The biggest risk to startup companies is the owner of the company. It's you. You're the biggest risk. Why? Because you don't know everything. You don't have the capitalization. And you're kind of happy-go-lucky people. You're very happy because you like your stuff. No. Risk mitigation is like, oh God, it's the doomsday. Where like, what are all the things that could go wrong? So you're inherently happy people and you're very excited and you're really, let's go. But risk mitigation is actually like, oh, caca, what could go wrong here, right? And you gotta list all that down. So it's a shift in the way you see the world, right? So you're actually the problem. And if you're younger, what is the real difference? You don't have as much business experience, right? So again, why can I do risk mitigation better than you? It's just because I'm older than you, right? So you're a risk. And the other thing is that if I have $100,000 and I can do it in businesses, why am I going to do it to you if you're fairly young or inexperienced? Because if you were doing a product and I was doing a product and they were going to give $100,000 to you or me, where are they going? They're going to me. Why? Not because I'm great, not because I'm nice, because I'm not on either one. I know more, been around the block, have more business experience, right? So you're the company's biggest risk. Own that. You don't know everything. And so how are you going to get the experience that you need? Now, it's great to collaborate with other people, but if you're talking to other people who've never run a business, that's not helping you. So you've got to get some real experience from people who know what they're doing, and you got to own the risk. And the best way you can do it is say, oh God, I don't know anything about that. I don't know anything about that. I don't know anything about that. I better get some help. When you do risk management and risk assessment, you figure out what you don't know. That is the first step that you take to de-risking yourself as a CEO or as an owner. If you own a business or you're starting it, you're the CEO, that's a lot of responsibility. It ain't just the title and fun. It's a lot of responsibility. And so now you're a CEO. We've all worked for people who aren't that good. We know that. You're working for yourself, but you're not that good. You're not that experienced. You may know one thing about the product or the service, but you don't know everything you need to know to run a business. So you are actually the biggest risk to the company in the startup phase. Okay, sorry, hurt your feelings. I know, doesn't matter. Okay, so you can take it. All right, here's how do we round this back up. What is the purpose of a company? The purpose of a company is to make money. And there's a big difference from commercialization and your first sale to break even. But once you get to break even, the company shifts in the way it manages. You now manage for things like production scale, reducing expenses, mitigating tax liability, all that other fun stuff. But until you get to break even, sometimes you're managing by milestones, right? But whatever it is, your job is to get to break even and then beyond that. So it's either break even or profitability and growth. That's the purpose of a company. Now, if you're the owner of a business, you're whatever, the stockholder, the board of directors, the founders, whatever, what is your responsibility? Your responsibility is to get to that money and do that lawfully, legally, safely, without risk or minimized risk, right? So you can say, okay, good, I'm either going to grow this company so it is profitable and I can hire 500 people in my community, or maybe your goal is to have a strategic exit because you think Medtronic's going to buy your device, whatever, right? But your job as a responsible party is to say, the goal of the company is to make money and be profitable. My job is to get it there. And one of the biggest things you do in getting it there is your job is to manage risk. When I have CEOs who go before their boards of directors and they are not describing the risk currently to the company, I know they're not doing their job. They're telling them, oh, this is how great we are and we did this. They're constantly telling them all the great stuff they do. They don't tell them we're at risk here.
today because of these things. This is the risk we have. These are the risks we mitigated. When you're a CEO and you're reporting to the board, you should be talking about risk. So if you're the owner of the business, this is why risk is so important, risk management. Identify the risks, figure out how you're going to solve it, right? Which ones are important, all of this stuff. Think a little bit bigger, right? And then manage, that's the second one. Operate safely, lawfully, plan for the disruptions, make sure you have enough money, make sure you have all the staffing you need. And guess what? Most of the times you don't have most of that stuff. The goal of a startup is to reduce risk in the corporate or strategic and functional or operational areas over time, so that as you start, here's where you should be, here's where you're starting at risk. So this is zero risk, this is a lot of risk. You start here now, and the idea is at minimum, by the time you get to break even, you should be managing at a very good low level of risk. There is no such thing as going to zero risk, right? The people who make Tylenol know that every time they do that, years ago, they had somebody who opened up the tops and put poison in there and killed a bunch of people, right? That's why we wrap all the top of that stuff. So we know, and let's talk about Boeing, right? They outsourced, they used to be the best in safety in the world. That's why they're who they are. Then they merged with McDonnell Douglas, and McDonnell Douglas cared more about profits. So they outsourced everything. And so, you know, the door that fell off, it was outsourced, right? And so they managed somebody else, and then they forgot to check the bolts or whatever, right? Problem, right? Again, every time you outsource, you are at risk, right? So think about that. What are you responsible for? The reason Boeing's going to be in trouble is because it's their airplane, and they made a decision not to manufacture it themselves with in-house stuff, with their quality assurances. And they said, well, we bought the door from that company, and that company meets ISO standards. But they didn't check. And then there's the synergy of getting it there and actually, you know, putting the door on, right? Okay. Let me go back here. Oh. Here we go. Okay, final thoughts. Best practices. Now I've told you, identify and manage the risk. I think the biggest part is to accept it. I'm not here to try to make you feel better. I'm trying to tell you this is really important, right? So I think it's helpful to do some kind of risk assessment, whether you use those grids, however you want to do it. You can just do it on a spreadsheet. You can just say, these are what I think they are. They don't have to be complicated. They don't have to be really pretty. But I know that when we have investors who are looking at early stage companies, if you're not telling me what the risks are, then I'm going to be pummeling you on those questions about risk. And one of the biggest things is competitive risk. One of the biggest things you do is you talk about your competitive landscape, because they care a lot about somebody beating you. Because if you've come up with that idea, don't tell me somebody in Chicago or New York didn't come up with that idea, right? And then accept it. You have to move away from the state of that you currently are, but you have to own that, yeah, you're running at risk, right? And so I think it's important for you to understand that if you were running a company and it was really successful and there was 500 people now, you would spend a lot of your time as a senior manager doing risk analysis, looking at corrective actions and making defensive postures, and then assessing. So it's kind of the lesson learned sets, right? You mitigate, and then you're looking at your escalation, and then there's another column that said, is it solved? And then there's another column that says, how frequently are we going to check this, right? So if you're manufacturing a drug, the reason the drug prices are expensive is because they're batch testing all the time. At every stage of production, they're taking out samples and making sure it's still safe, it's not poisonous, it's not degraded, all that stuff, right? So they're constantly doing batch testing. Check, 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 check. Is the quality still the same? So you have to do the same thing as a senior manager. In your business, you don't just do risk assessment and say, well, that's where we are. Guess what? They do this all the time, right? Risk assessment meetings are happening quarterly, monthly, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, they're kind of boring, but they're very important, right? And so again, when you're doing it all the time, you get into a groove of understanding what the risks are. And then you own, okay, I know I'm at risk there. I don't have enough money, but I'm going to concentrate on this. You make those decisions, and where you make those decisions makes or breaks you. Okay. So that's kind of that in a nutshell. Hopefully that's, fairly depressing, but that's kind of the idea. And if you would do that, you could do that with each other. You could do it at lunch or whatever, then own the problems. But it's not just about the risk of your product or your service and is it going to make it in the market. It's not just, oh, there's nobody else in the market. The risk to your company is you as a company are not going to make it. It's separate from whether your product is a good idea or whether you have a market or whether people are going to like it. There is way more risk to your company than that. And I know for most of you, cash is one of the biggest issues, okay? And that's, what do we know about cash? It's going to kill you if you don't have it. You'll be out of business. So own it, right? Manage it. Okay, so I think we have time for some questions, right? So does anybody have some questions? And I don't know how the online people ask questions. But I know that I gave Linda, so here's my email, but Linda has it. So there's two Lindas here, but Linda has it. And so if you have questions, you can email me. I'm not going to charge anybody for this. I won't give you as much time as my paying clients, but if you have some questions or you want to think it through. The other thing is that I think it's helpful to do these risk assessments and then have people here at eBridge look at that. So if you've got some really good mentors and you got people in your industry, so say you're writing software, you ought to have some software people looking at that. If you're doing a medical device, you ought to have people in engineering looking at that, right? So make them help you identify risk. And to me, it's a big part of managing business. And usually, like I said, when I see companies going out for pitches, I want to see a page on risk. I want to see it. I want you to tell me what the risk is, and I'm going to figure out whether you know what you're doing or not by that list. So if you want to hide something because you don't want to tell me it, yeah, you're not going to get funded. I know, right? Like, because you're always going up to people like me, right? Old people, right? So we got money and we know what we're doing. So I want to see if you can identify the risk, and I'm looking at you so that I can tell whether you can manage a business. And I'm also looking at you as a person. Can you own it? Right? It's a big part. It's a big part of being able to run a business well, right? Okay. And a lot of companies, as you know, they have big problems, right? Products fail, the door falls off of Boeing, right? Like, how are they going to do this, right? And so guess what's happening at Boeing right now? What do you think they're doing? A hell of a lot of risk assessment, right? The door fell off. Everybody in the world knows that. And they did fall down on quality. They absolutely did. And so where's the problem? They got to go back, and somebody didn't get something on the list. Somebody said, oh, well, that company was, certified, and they let it be, right? So that's where the CEO of Boeing is for the next 3 months on risk, right? Because the stock price already fell, and he is responsible for it. Okay, so any questions? Hopeful? Sad? Little sad? Little depressing, a little scary, yeah. So the real answer is it's not easy, right? Running a business. And so I don't want you to have a false impression that this is all happy stuff. It's not. Most people who start a business, they work very, very hard for long, long hours. They endure a lot of risk and a lot of pitfalls. And the ones who make it persevere through that. And sometimes you can be a great manager and the product is just, it's not as good as you think. Sometimes the product is really not good and you're a great manager and somehow, you're selling purple cowboy hats is what the example I was using earlier. You're selling purple cowboy hats at Target and making boatloads of money, right? So it's hard to always know, but as a CEO, you are responsible for risk assessment and risk mitigation. Okay, so the slides I think will be available too. So if you want to look at those grids, you can. I don't really recommend them that methodically at this stage. It's a little bit too much work and that's why you won't do it. But I don't think it hurts for you to come up, for example, with a couple of slides and a pitch deck if that's what you're going to do, and prepare those slides on risk. That doesn't necessarily mean you'll inherently use them, right? Like when you do pitch decks, you'll develop 40 slides and you'll use 20. Because depending on who you're talking to or what the point of the business is, you don't necessarily use all those slides, but it's a way for you to think through your business. So you ought to have 2 or 3 slides in there on risk. Whether you use that for a particular pitch presentation, doesn't matter. You've now started to address and quantify and identify risk. So that would be a faster way to do it than doing the grid and all that stuff. Usually what happens with the grid is you can't do that yourself. You're supposed to have more than one person doing it because you'll argue. I think that's a 4. No, I think that's a 3. I mean, I've sat through 2 hours of meetings where everybody's talking about whether it's a 3 or 4. Who cares, right? But usually those grids are done when it's more than one person, and it's usually the functional area and management, or it's 2 levels down in functional area and then their supervisors. So usually when you're doing those grids, it's more than one person doing it because it's a collective thing to say, we as a team think that's the risk. If it's just you, then you just write a couple slides, but at least do it. Okay.
Nice.
All right, good. I think that's it. Okay, no problem. And I think Derek, you're coming back up, right? Yeah, Derek's gonna end it.
No questions, guys, for Linda?
Yeah, and there's no questions online either.
Thank you, Anil.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks. Great. Awesome, guys. Well, thank you all again for attending today's seminar series. We'll be coming back again next month. Again, thank you, Linda, for the great presentation, super informative. Next month, so there will be a change of location. So rather than being here in Brownsville at the eBridge Center, we're looking to move to the UTRGV location in Harlingen. So we're going to be moving around the next couple months just to get some further exposure amongst the audience down here in the Valley. We hope to see you there. Recording will be sent out here in the next 24 hours or so you guys will have access to today's presentations along with the slides that Linda went through. Any questions that you guys have for us, feel free to reach out to me as well. My email is also within the recording. But thanks again, guys. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. And Derek knows how to reach me, so if you ever can't find me, you can just reach me and he'll find me.